The steel wheels of Marcus Williams' wheelchair locked against the frozen concrete as the bus doors hissed shut in his face, leaving him stranded in the Minnesota blizzard with nothing but the bitter taste of rejection and the sound of chains grinding against asphalt as the vehicle disappeared into the white void. "Please," he had whispered through chattering teeth, his breath forming desperate clouds in the sub-zero air. "I've got exact change. Just need to get to the VA hospital." But driver Carl Brennan had looked down at the wheelchair, at the stumps, where Marcus's legs should have been, at the Purple Heart pin on his worn army jacket, and shaken his head with the casual cruelty of a man who'd never risked anything for anyone. "Bus policy, wheelchair spaces for paying customers only. You're blocking the entrance." Now Marcus sat alone in the December darkness, watching his fingers turn white through his threadbare gloves as the wind cut through his jacket like shrapnel. The digital display at the bus stop read 18 degree, but with the wind chill, it felt like being back in the Afghan mountains where he'd lost his legs to an IED 3 years ago. 3 years since Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams of the 101st Airborne had thrown himself on a grenade to save his squad. 3 years since he'd woken up in a German hospital missing everything below the knees. 3 years of learning to navigate a world that thanked him for his service with words, but abandoned him with actions. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd survived Taliban mortars and roadside bombs, only to be defeated by a city bus in Minneapolis. 15 feet away, a group of teenagers huddled in the heated bus shelter, their phones glowing like digital campfires. Marcus had asked to join them, but the shelter belonged to premium transit pass holders, and his disability check couldn't cover the monthly fee. So he sat outside in his wheelchair, watching his breath crystallize while kids half his age stayed, warm behind glass walls. "This is fucked up," one of the teenagers said, a 17-year-old named Devin Martinez whose father had died in Iraq when Devin was 8. "He's a veteran." "Not our problem," replied another Ashley Chen, though her voice carried less conviction than her words suggested. But Devin was already pulling out his phone, the camera app glowing to life as he stepped outside the shelter. Marcus noticed the movement but was too focused on staying conscious to pay attention to what was happening around him. Hypothermia was setting in, the same fuzzy warmth he'd felt bleeding out in Afghanistan before the medics found him. "Hey man," Devin said, approaching carefully. "You okay?" Marcus looked up with eyes that had seen too much and lost too much hope. "Been better, son." "What's your name?" "Marcus Williams. Staff Sergeant. Retired." The military bearing was still there, even sitting in a wheelchair with frostbite creeping up his fingers. Devin held up his phone. "Mind if I record this? What happened here?" Marcus almost said no. He'd had enough of being a spectacle, enough of well-meaning civilians gawking at the broken soldier. But something in the kid's eyes reminded him of the young privates he'd trained in Afghanistan, eager and decent in a world that would test both qualities. "Bus driver wouldn't let me on," Marcus said simply. "Said the wheelchair space was for paying customers only. I had the fare, but what? Look at me, son. I'm not exactly the image they want on their premium service." Devin's camera captured it all. The Purple Heart pin, the wheelchair locked in ice, the way Marcus's lips were turning blue despite his attempts to maintain dignity. More importantly, it captured the contrast. A disabled veteran freezing outside, while teenagers stayed warm in a heated shelter marked for premium passengers only. "This is Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams," Devin said to the camera. "He served 3 tours in Afghanistan, lost his legs saving his squad from a grenade, and, tonight, Minneapolis Metro Transit left him to freeze because his wheelchair might inconvenience paying customers." Ashley emerged from the shelter, her conscience finally overcoming her comfort. "We should call someone." "Who?" Devin asked, still recording. "Police? They'll take a report and file it away. EMTs? They'll take him to a hospital he can't afford. Social services? They've got a 6-month waiting list." Marcus tried to wave them away. "Don't worry about me, kids, I'll figure something out." But Devin was already uploading the video to TikTok with hashtags that would change everything. Veteran left behind, we do not leave, our own, disabled, veterans, Minneapolis. The internet moved faster than sympathy these days, and outrage was the currency, that bought action. Within an hour, the video had 10,000 views. Within 3 hours, it had gone viral across multiple platforms. Within 6 hours, local news stations were picking up the story. And within 12 hours, something unprecedented was happening in cities across America. Marcus woke up in the VA hospital's emergency room, his fingers and toes throbbing with returning circulation but intact, thanks to Devon's quick thinking in calling for an ambulance. A nurse, a young veteran herself, checked his vitals while explaining what had happened. Overnight. "You're internet famous," she said with a smile that carried its own trauma. "Kid who found you posted a video. It's been viewed 2 million times." Marcus felt embarrassed rather than vindicated. "Great. Now I'm the poster boy for pathetic veterans." "No," the nurse said firmly. "You're the face of something bigger." She showed him the news coverage on her tablet. The story had exploded beyond social media into mainstream consciousness, but not in the way Marcus expected. Instead of pity, the response was fury. Instead of charity, it was action. Minneapolis Metro Transit was facing a firestorm of criticism. Their phone lines were jammed with complaints. Protesters surrounded their headquarters demanding policy changes and the firing of driver Carl Brennan. The hashtag, "We do not leave our own," was trending nationwide, but it wasn't just about Marcus anymore. Veterans across the country were sharing their own stories of discrimination and abandonment, denied housing because of PTSD diagnoses, rejected from jobs because of visible disabilities, ignored by VA bureaucracy designed more to process claims than heal people. The video had become a lightning rod for decades of accumulated rage about how America treated its warriors after the wars ended. But the most surprising development was happening on the streets. Marcus watched the news coverage with growing amazement as reporter after reporter stood outside bus stops and transit stations, where volunteer groups had appeared overnight. Veterans organizations, community groups, and ordinary citizens were setting up warming stations, distributing blankets, and demanding accessible public transportation. In Denver, a group of Iraq War veterans had occupied a bus station until management agreed to remove fees for accessibility accommodations. In Atlanta, nursing students were providing free medical care at transit stops. In Phoenix, construction workers were building wheelchair ramps at stations that had never bothered with ADA compliance. "We don't leave our own behind," became the rallying cry, borrowed from military culture but expanding beyond it to encompass anyone society had discarded. The movement wasn't without controversy. Critics argued that viral videos were poor foundations for policy change, that emotional responses didn't solve systemic problems, that Marcus's situation was being exploited for political purposes. They weren't entirely wrong. Within 48 hours, politicians from both parties were using his story to promote their own agendas about veteran care, public transportation, and disability rights. But something else was happening, something that transcended political opportunism and social media outrage cycles. Real people were taking real action to solve real problems, one bus stop at a time. Marcus was discharged from the hospital on a Tuesday morning to find Devon waiting for him with a small crowd of supporters. The teenager had become an unlikely activist, using his 15 minutes of fame to organize practical assistance rather than seeking attention for himself. "How are you feeling?" Devon asked as they loaded Marcus's wheelchair into a volunteer's van. "Like I've been hit by a truck," Marcus replied honestly. "But alive. Thanks to you." "Don't thank me yet. There's something you need to see." They drove through Minneapolis streets that looked different somehow, not physically, but energetically. At bus stops and transit stations, small groups of volunteers had set up warming stations with thermoses of coffee and military surplus blankets. Signs reading, "We don't leave our own behind," marked locations where disabled passengers could wait indoors regardless of their fare status. But the most dramatic change was at the bus stop where Marcus had nearly frozen. The old shelter had been replaced overnight by a larger heated structure with wheelchair accessibility and space for multiple disabled passengers. A bronze plaque read, "Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams Memorial Shelter, dedicated to all who served." "Memorial?" Marcus asked with dark humor. I'm not dead yet. Close enough, Devin said. Besides, this isn't really about you anymore. He was right. The movement that had started with one veteran's near-death experience had evolved into something larger, a nationwide reckoning with how America treated its most vulnerable citizens. Veterans were just the visible face of a broader crisis affecting disabled people, homeless individuals, and anyone who didn't fit society's narrow definition of deserving. Over the following weeks, Marcus found himself reluctantly thrust into a role he'd never wanted, spokesman for a movement he didn't fully understand. Interview requests poured in from major networks. Publishing companies offered book deals. Speaking bureaus wanted to book him for conferences about veteran advocacy and disability rights. He turned down most of the opportunities, preferring to work quietly with local organizations that were doing the actual work of helping people rather than talking about helping people. But he couldn't entirely escape the spotlight, especially when the movement began facing its first serious challenges. The backlash was predictable, but vicious. Conservative media figures accused the volunteers of virtue signaling and exploiting tragedy for political gain. Progressive activists criticized the movement for centering veterans instead of addressing broader systemic inequalities. Local governments complained about unauthorized use of public property for the warming stations. More troubling were the conflicts within the movement itself. Some veteran groups wanted to focus exclusively on military personnel, arguing that expanding the mission would dilute the message. Others pushed for broader inclusion, insisting that leaving anyone behind violated the core principle. Funding disputes arose as donations poured in faster than organizations could distribute them responsibly. Marcus watched the infighting with the weary recognition of someone who'd seen idealism corrupted by ego and politics before. Afghanistan had taught him that good intentions weren't enough to win wars, and civilian activism seemed to follow similar patterns. Initial unity fractured by competing priorities and personality conflicts. But he also saw something else. The warming stations kept operating. The volunteers kept showing up. The bus shelters kept getting built, one at a time, by people who cared more about solving problems than getting credit for solutions. 3 months after the video went viral, Marcus sat in a coffee shop near the University of Minnesota, meeting with Devin to discuss the movement's future. The teenager had been accepted to several colleges but was considering deferring admission to continue his advocacy work. "Don't," Marcus said firmly. "Go to school. Get your education. This movement will survive without you." "But there's so much work left to do," Devin protested. "There always is. That's why it's called work, not a vacation." Marcus stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "You did something amazing here, son. You saw someone who needed help and you helped them. That's where it starts and where it ends. One person helping another person. But the bigger picture is made up of smaller pictures. Every warming station, every ramp, every time someone chooses to help instead of walking away. You can't solve everything, but you can solve something." Devin nodded reluctantly, but Marcus could see the young man was still wrestling with the weight of unexpected influence. Fame was a burden that few teenagers were equipped to handle, especially when it came attached to other people's suffering. "What about you?" Devin asked. "The publishers are still calling. The speaking bureaus want to book you for events. You could make a lot of money telling your story." Marcus had been thinking about that question for weeks. The financial temptation was real. His disability payments barely covered rent and groceries, and the medical bills from his frostbite treatment were mounting. A book deal or speaking career could provide security he'd never known as a disabled veteran. But something felt wrong about profiting from a movement that had started with his near-death experience. The volunteers weren't getting paid. The warming stations were funded by donations from people who couldn't afford to give. Turning his story into a business seemed like a betrayal of the values that had created the movement in the first place. "I'll stick with what I'm doing," he said finally. "Working with the local organizations, helping out where I can, staying out of the spotlight as much as possible." "That's probably wise," Devin agreed. "The movement's bigger than any one person. Now." He was right about that. 6 months after the video went viral, We Don't Leave Our Own Behind had evolved into a nationwide network of volunteer organizations focused on practical assistance for vulnerable populations. The dramatic rhetoric had given way to mundane but essential work. Building ramps, staffing warming stations, advocating for policy changes at the local level. Some chapters focused on veterans, others on disabled civilians, still others on homeless populations or elderly individuals who'd been abandoned by failing social safety nets. The diversity of focus reflected both the movement's strength and its challenge. Broad appeal that sometimes led to diffuse energy and competing priorities. Marcus found his role settling into something he was comfortable with. A bridge between the military community and civilian activists who were trying to help, but didn't always understand veteran culture. He spoke at VA hospitals about navigating bureaucracy, consulted with architects designing accessible facilities, and occasionally testified at city council meetings about public transportation policies. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was useful work. Every wheelchair ramp built correctly, every warming station staffed reliably, every policy changed incrementally, represented a small victory against the forces that had left him freezing at a bus stop. The first anniversary of the viral video was marked by commemorative events in dozens of cities, but Marcus skipped most of them. Instead, he spent the day at the bus stop where it had all started, watching commuters use the accessible shelter that had been built in his name. Most of the passengers were ordinary people, workers heading to jobs, students traveling to classes, seniors going to medical appointments. They used the wheelchair ramps and heated waiting areas without thinking about the struggle that had created them, which was exactly how it should be. Infrastructure was successful when it was invisible, when accessibility was simply part of the normal experience, rather than a special accommodation. Devin found him there as evening approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee from a nearby shop that had become a regular meeting place for local activists. "Any regrets?" the young man asked, settling onto a bench that had been designed to accommodate both wheelchairs and traditional seating. Marcus considered the question carefully. The past year had been a whirlwind of unexpected attention, difficult decisions, and gradual realization that his personal crisis had become a catalyst for changes he'd never imagined possible. About what? Nearly freezing to death? Being recorded, without permission? Becoming the face of a movement I didn't start? Any of it. All of it. Marcus watched a city bus pull up to the stop, its wheelchair lift functioning smoothly as an elderly woman in a motorized chair boarded without drama or delay. The driver, a different person than Carl Brennan, who had been fired and faced federal discrimination charges, helped secure the wheelchair and waited patiently as other passengers found seats. "No regrets," he said finally. "Not about the important parts." What he didn't tell Devin, what he'd never told anyone, was that the night at the bus stop hadn't been an accident. Marcus had known about the shelter's premium passenger policy, had known he'd be refused entry, had chosen that location deliberately, because he'd wanted to die somewhere public enough that his body would be found quickly, but private enough that he wouldn't traumatize children. The 3 years since losing his legs had been a slow descent into despair that VA counseling and disability payments couldn't address. He'd felt abandoned by a country that celebrated his service while ignoring his suffering, trapped in a body that would never again match his sense of self, facing decades of poverty and isolation with no hope of meaningful improvement. The bus stop had been his chosen ending. Hypothermia was supposed to be peaceful, they said, like falling asleep in the cold. He'd even written a note, still tucked in his wallet, explaining his decision and absolving everyone of blame. Devin's intervention had saved his life. But more than that, the movement that followed had given him something he'd lost in Afghanistan, a sense of purpose beyond survival. The warming stations, the advocacy work, the small daily victories against indifference, they'd provided reasons to stay alive that existed outside his own pain. But the deepest irony was that his attempted suicide had been transformed into a symbol of resilience. His moment of ultimate despair reframed as evidence of society's obligation to help its most vulnerable members. The movement's rallying cry, "We don't leave our own behind," had been inspired by his decision to leave himself behind, abandoned by a system that treated veterans as props for political theater rather than human beings deserving of dignity. The truth was too complex for viral videos or political slogans, too dark for the inspiring narrative that had motivated thousands of volunteers to build ramps and staff warming stations. So Marcus kept it to himself, carrying the secret like shrapnel that had worked its way too deep to be safely removed. As Devon prepared to leave for college and the movement continued evolving beyond its origins, Marcus made peace with the contradiction at the heart of his story. Sometimes the most important truths were the ones that couldn't be spoken aloud, and sometimes the greatest gifts came from our darkest moments transformed by other people's kindness. He was alive not because he'd chosen to live, but because a teenager with a phone had chosen to care about a stranger's suffering. That was enough truth for one lifetime, and more hope than he'd ever expected to find in the wreckage of his original plans.